This is Ken Resnick, and I'm where else? In the Wrestling Epicenter.
You're listening to Interactive Wrestling Radio, featuring the Interactive Interview, courtesy of WrestlingEpicenter.com.
They're the Ring Warriors, and maybe tonight they'll be on. Thank you for indulging me in that. It's something I said I would do, and by golly, I did it. That's a horrible Weird Al Yankovic version of Dawkins' Dream Warriors, which was used for the Nightmare on Elm Street 3 soundtrack. In fact, that was the subtitle of the film. And I'm doing that as a parody because Ring Warriors is upon us. Hi guys, my name is James Walsh, and you're listening to Interactive Wrestling Radio. And this week we bring you a backstage interviewer from Ring Warriors who's got a lineage in wrestling that dates back to the AWA, the WWF, LPWA, TCW, and beyond. He's a true wrestling legend, been around a long time, knows the ins and outs of this business in so many different ways, and we get to pick his brain. Of course, I'm talking about Ken Resnick. Hope you guys enjoy this interview. I hope you guys check out on WGN America every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. Ring Warriors. You got Austin Aries. You got Alex Chamberlain. Both guys been on our show before. You have Wes Briscoe, Marty the Moth Martinez as Marty Casaus. There's a lot of great talent there. Jeff Cobb. Definitely worth watching. Chase Stevens and the Naturals are on there too. So a lot of great talent to see on Ring Warriors. A different old school style presentation of professional wrestling. For those that have been hungering for it, it's there, it's available, it's out there. It's on your television screen every Saturday morning, 8 a.m. So there's no excuse. Tune in and enjoy wrestling the way it was meant to be.
This is Bobby the Brain Heenan, and if you're smart like me, you'll be listening to Interactive Interview. I do all the time.
Available now in the archives at interactivewrestlingradio.com. It's our exclusive interview with the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes.
So no, we respect each other in the ring and what we've done, and there's a respect there. And even though if he would say something bad, he kept coming back to that respect thing. People had told me, but there's a respect there. But it's business. Business is business with me and him.
This classic 2005 interview can be heard at WrestlingEpicenter.com and InteractiveWrestlingRadio.com.
Hi, gang. This is Mean Gene Okerlund from World Wrestling Entertainment, reminding you you're where it's at with the Interactive Interview right here online.
Welcome back to Interactive Wrestling Radio. On the Newsmaker line with me right now is a legend in the world of professional wrestling who currently is participating in the Ring Warriors project on on WGN. There's so many letters in wrestling these days. WGN America. It is Ken Resnick. Mr. Resnick, are you with us?
I am indeed, James. I don't know if I'd go right to the legend part, but I appreciate the thought.
Well, you say that a lot, but if you read a lot of comments about you online, a lot of people put you up there with the greats of all time when it comes to, as Bobby Heenan used to phrase it, broadcast journalism. I've
seen them, and I mean this sincerely. Every time I see comments like that from people that, I don't know, that are not friends or, someone I've never met, I'm somewhere between humbled and just amazed that people feel that way about the work that I did. And I mean, it's an honor that as many years as I've earned a living talking, it's really hard to put into words. I read those comments, and it's just I'm amazed and so honored and humbled when I see that. Because, you know, your friends always try to tell you, you know, what a good job you're doing or this or that. But when it comes from strangers, it's pretty amazing.
Very cool. And, you know, I'm one of those people who say those things, so I hope you do take it to heart a little bit. And I did say this in a review, and I'll say it to you now. Your involvement in Ring Warriors kind of gives it a little bit of credibility by having somebody who's been around and seen all these big territories like the AWA, like the WWE, like I can keep going on and on and on, LPWA, so on and so forth. But you give a
Sure.
little bit of credibility to that company. How did you get involved in Ring Warriors?
The executive producer, a gentleman named Howard Lipkind, I've known for over 20 years. In fact, the last time I worked with him, I think was in 1999 when I did when he was the executive producer of the Bryant Gumbel Celebrity Golf Tournament from Walt Disney World that I co-hosted for him, that aired on ESPN, and we'd kind of always stayed in touch. And when he became executive producer, I don't know if he was the one that originally brought my name up or someone else, but he was the one that called me, and we hadn't talked in quite some time, and actually sent me a private message on Facebook wanting to know what my number was. And, you know, he said, I'm going to call you on a Sunday night. And it was funny. That's his sense of humor. The day before, he sent me a Facebook message. He said, just to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about. And it was a scene from, I think it was either The Godfather 2 or Godfather 3 with Al Pacino, where he's standing there and he goes, just when you think you're done, they drag you back. And then, you know, he told me that he was going to be executive producer for Ring Warriors. And, you know, I was aware of it, you know, the history of it with Hiro Matsudo, who I'd met over in Tokyo, and Howard Brody. And initially I kind of said, well, you know, gee, Howard, if there's any, you know, advice I can give you or, you know, any questions, you know, feel free to, you know, give me a call. And he said, well, we decided we're going to do a little bit of old school with interviews, and we want you to do them. So that's how the whole thing came about.
Very cool. And you mentioned the word old school, and that's kind of what it's been billed as, the new era of old school wrestling. You were also involved in TCW, Traditional Championship Wrestling. Seems like there is a large sect of wrestling fan who's looking for wrestling that reminds us of what we loved when we were kids, and maybe wrestling that our kids can watch. Why do you think there is such a interest in the old school style of wrestling?
You know, I think as successful as WWE is, and you know, I always kind of laugh where sometimes I'll read people just ripping it on social media, but it's obvious they watch every week. You know, the success they have, but they're more and they bill themselves more as sports entertainment. And I think, you know, the analogy I've given, where the demand comes from old school, it's like, James, if you go to a movie, you know, even say the Star Wars franchise, or, you know, back in my time, the James Bond franchise, you know it's a fiction, but while you're in the theater, you want to believe what you're seeing. And, you know, I think a lot of old school wrestling fans, when they're watching wrestling or going to wrestling, they want the kind of classic good guy versus bad guy where it's really obvious, and they just want it to be believable enough where they can become engrossed in the story while they're either there in person or watching on television. And I think old school makes that a little easier.
I would agree. I would agree. And if you saw, there was a kind of thing that I don't know if you'd call it a meme, but there was a fan in the crowd who said it's still real to me, and he broke into tears. And they was posted on a show called Tosh.0, which is kind of a making fun of pop culture things, and all the crowd's laughing at it. And I'm kind of sitting there thinking, well, I get where he's coming from. The fan who's crying, at a wrestling convention, saying it's still real to him, because I think deep down that's what we kind of, we know it's not. We know the deal, for lack of a better term, but we want to believe, at least for that time that's on, we want to, be lost in the story.
Well, I think you're right. And I kind of laugh when I think back to my time in AWA and WWF, and even as you mentioned, LPWA.
Mm-hmm.
Fans that sometimes would recognize me if I'm just out and about and would want to engage in conversation, and they would always kind of go, I mean, it's not real, is it? And now when as Bobby Heenan, as you mentioned, kind of said when Vince was forthcoming, Bobby said, that's it, the magic's dead. I will still run into fans now that will sometimes, basically say, I know everybody says it's sports entertainment, but I mean, it's not all, is it? So, I mean, fans today still down deep want to try and believe. It's like almost an analogy I've sometimes said. It's like kids when they get to that age where they kind of know Santa Claus isn't real, but down deep they still kind of hope he is.
Yeah.
and I think that's probably what part of today's wrestling fan goes through.
I think that's fair. Yeah. You mentioned AWA. You mentioned your time in AWA. I got to ask you, you're a guy who grew up in Minnesota. You're still in Minnesota. To know that your name is forever linked with the letters AWA and Vern Gagne, that's got to be a cool thing to still hang in your hat.
It is. And, the other day I was kind of reflecting back. Someone, in fact, I'll go ahead. Tokyo Monster Cahagas, who I've gotten to know and is such a great human being, and I mean a really great wrestling talent, was on the first Ring Warriors show a few weeks ago.
Yep.
And mentioned on social media that how excited he was because that was his first time on national television. And I had never really thought about it. I was excited about being involved with Ring Warriors because I knew it was going to give a lot of younger wrestlers with great talent some exposure that they hadn't been able to generate. But I never realized that for some of the great veterans in the industry, that was also going to be their first time. And I started to think back that so many people in this business that have eventually achieved great success really paid their dues in small territories and 8, 9, 10-hour car rides to, wrestle, in a smaller venue just for the experience. And how lucky was I to start, in the AWA, which was on, in all these major markets. But at the same time, I was able to learn the business by, them talking to me and equally me just sitting back and listening from, the likes of Blackjack Lanza and Nick Bockwinkel and Bobby Heenan the Crusher and Mad Dog, watching Kurt Hennig, become the star he was, just observing and talking and learning from those people. And when I think back at the talent that there was in the AWA and the Hulk Hogan's, I mean it was amazing. And it's funny. A lot of people aren't really big on social media, but back in those days, I didn't watch myself on TV that much.
Right.
And now I see all these older interviews from AWA and WWF, and I think that people post and I get a chance to watch. But at the same time, it's a little sad because normally all these interviews get posted when somebody from that era, has passed.
Yeah, and that's been a case with this show too. And I don't want to say it, but like Bruno Sammartino, for example, he passed away. The first thing I did was jumped on Facebook and posted my interview with him. And Jim the Anvil Neidhart, same thing, and a lot of the guys. So it is a sad thing when some of the legends are leaving us way too soon.
Yeah. I mean, I think people are also realizing, especially back in those days, like my time with WWF, which was great and phenomenal. And in the same way, I sit back and think that, how lucky was I to get to, besides the interviews, to do color with Gorilla Monsoon from the Boston Garden. And
that was I saw that
Garden.
picture you posted with you and Gorilla, and that was a really cool image. Yes.
Yep. And and then to again do interviews and work with, but learn from again Hulk and Bobby Heenan and the Macho Man and George the Animal Steele and Jimmy Hart and Lou Albano and Freddie Blassie. I mean, I really do think about so many talented people in the industry that never really get to the big time, if you will, for just lack of any other term.
Right.
And my literally the first two promotions I worked with was the legendary AWA and then the WWF. And I mean, I always try and remember, even when I get a chance to, do some independents or smaller promotions, just how lucky have I been in terms of people I've worked with, but people I've learned from. And literally to this day, even the very first interview of each taping at Ring Warriors, when I started in the AWA, and I've told this story, but I never forget to not remember it. Right after Gene Okerlund left for WWF, and I was the guy going to do all the interviews at AWA, I had gotten very close to Blackjack Lanza.
Right.
And, I was a little nervous. It wasn't like, I was starting at some small promotion. It's like, okay, now you're going to do interviews for Chicago and then Denver and then Winnipeg and Milwaukee and your hometown. And right before I was sitting with Jack, and he said, "Can I give you some advice?" And I said, "God, please do anything." And he said, "Always be yourself." He goes, "Don't try and emulate anyone else's style. You've got to be you, because if you're not, fans will see through it." And he said, more importantly, he said, "You know what the best way to get yourself over is?" And he said, "I'm talking about not only with the fans, but with the boys." And I said, "No, Jack, tell me." He said, "The best way to get yourself over, don't ever try and get yourself over."
Ah.
In other words, be humble, make it about the show, make it about the talent, don't make it about yourself. And he said, by not making it about yourself, everybody will realize that you're all about trying to put everyone else over and the show over. And I literally, wherever I am or anything I do in the business, I always repeat those words to myself before I start.
Very cool. Very cool. If I could take a step back, we'll get back to Ring Warriors in just a sec, but if I could take a step back, something that never gets discussed very much is a project you were part of, probably as part of the AWA more so, but was Pro Wrestling USA, which seemed to be a lot of companies trying to band together against the evil empire, as it were, that was building for the WWE. Is there a story there? Is there a story behind the rise and fall of Pro Wrestling USA?
Well, I think, as you said, the story about the rise was the promoters could see that Vince was just doing something that they couldn't match, whether it was budget-wise or television-wise. And they kind of said, the only way we're going to be able to survive is to band together with a national show to go up against him. So that, was the rise. Vern was able to, at that time, partner with Eddie Einhorn, who was a minority owner of the Chicago White Sox, and I think one of the other Chicago pro sports teams. So I think that was the story behind the rise. They were able to get on ESPN. But I think the biggest reason for the fall was that even though it was all the promoters from different parts of the country and different promotions with one goal in mind, they always thought that goal should be achieved by putting their guys over. So I think that was contributed as much to the fall or lack of success, maybe would be a better term, of Pro Wrestling USA.
When I was on AM radio, I used to get in trouble with my program director because I'd always reference the past, and they say, "Well, don't talk about the past. Always talk about the current." And
what? Wait a minute. You got in trouble? What?
Exactly. So I thought of that when I was typing an article about All In, which was the big pay-per-view that just happened about a month ago now, actually, a month ago yesterday. I was comparing it to Pro Wrestling USA, and I said, well, there's a potential it won't work because the guys at Impact are going to want their guys to go over, and the guys at Ring of Honor are going to want their guys to go over. And I kind of was talking about just what you were talking about, and it didn't happen that way, so that was pretty cool. But wanted to throw that in, that, what's old is new again in some ways.
Well, actually, in a lot of ways, James, and not just in wrestling. Kind of in everything, what's old is new.
You mentioned LPWA. We're seeing a rise in women's wrestling right now. WWE is doing their own women's-only pay-per-view. There's women involved in almost every episode thus far of Ring Warriors. What do you think of the fact that women's wrestling is finally getting that mainstream exposure, and were the girls back then ready for that exposure back when you were with LPWA?
I mean, I think it's great, and they were absolutely ready for it. But the reason the LPWA didn't succeed long term was simple, because I was also involved in the business end. There were no national cable deals in those days. So LPWA had to do syndication deals with every single television station. And I was involved in a lot of that and talked to a lot of program directors. And some of them were really honest. They said, look, the show's great. We love it. There's nothing that we couldn't air in terms of violence or anything else. And, the show's great. I think it would do pretty well. But he said, or many times it was women, that we just can't put a show on with women beating up women. And that was the biggest problem, was just the syndication. I mean, even today, with Ring Warriors, national outlet on WGN America.
Right.
But if you think about trying to syndicate, whether you're, we were close and had a deal on Madison Square Garden Network, but sometimes you couldn't get on in Green Bay because the program director said, look, we just, our advertisers and our station owner just, it's still women hitting women. We can't do it. So while today one national deal and you're good, you're good to go. Back then, that didn't exist. There really were no super stations, and it just became, too costly when you could cut a deal with a station, and just too time consuming. And even when I was with WWF, in the mid and late 80s, there were days, James, when we would do like 75 to 100 interviews in a day, because every single interview was market specific. And then we would also have to do a non-market specific, for prime time. But if we were running a house show, in Chicago, we had to do 3 interviews that aired within the show in Chicago that, mentioned Rosemont Horizon, the date, the place, who was on the card, where today you don't do that anymore. I mean, if you think about WWE's broadcast, it's all about either the network and pay-per-views, where they bill it. I think WWE in person. They don't talk about house shows anymore. They just put a graphic on the bottom of the screen where they'll list upcoming house shows.
Right.
Where the whole focus has changed, at the national level. In fact, I literally marvel when you think about the number of hours of programming WWE between Raw and SmackDown and their network, the number of hours of programming they produce each week. They have become one of the largest production houses in the country in terms of number of television hours they produce. And, a lot of, as we talked about, old school wrestling fans get upset that it's more sports entertainment. And I said that the reality is, back in my time, and and really the WWF years, they were a wrestling organization that was on television. Their primary focus was wrestling. And really now they're a production and television entity who just produces wrestling, where it's almost like the focus is more on, the network and the television, and what airs is wrestling, where the wrestling itself, I don't think, is the primary focus. I mean, if you've ever gone to an arena that, is hosting a Raw or SmackDown, and see the tremendous amount of semis and buses and facilities that they set up to produce those live shows, it's amazing.
Absolutely.
And I think, but back in the day, the only discussion was about wrestling.
Absolutely.
And now it's almost not an afterthought, but it's certainly, I don't believe, the primary focus anymore.
Some say they don't even like the word wrestling anymore. So, All right. So let's away from wrestling a little bit. You did do a stint with roller derby, and we had a guy on our show a few years ago. Used to be on ESPN as well with the Global Wrestling Federation. Then on Wrestling TV was known as Craig Johnson. John Horton is his real name. He calls collegiate roller derby, which I never knew existed until I met him, and he is a huge fan of roller derby. And I kind of wanted to find out: does one thing lead to the other? Is it an easy transition to go from professional wrestling to roller derby?
Um, you mean as far as I was concerned?
As well, yeah, I guess as far as you're concerned, sure.
Um, just that I was used to doing television and had done some play-by-play and interviews and new product and editing, where it certainly made it a lot easier. When I auditioned and got the Roller Jam job, I remember watching the highlights of the old black and white roller derby, the San Francisco Bay Area Bombers, when I was a kid, but I really didn't understand the nuances of the game. And I went down, they flew me down, I auditioned with 4 or 5 other people, and they called and offered me the job. And I knew television, but when I got down there, when we started doing rehearsals, I didn't know enough about the game, and I was so lucky that I became friends with Buddy Atkinson Jr., who was certainly an old-time roller derby legend, as was his wife, Drew. And we started talking, and I said, Buddy, I can do television, but I need to understand the game more. And he spent so much time explaining the nuances that just helped me immeasurably, and we're still in contact today.
Very cool. All right, so let me ask you this. When you first did AWA TV 30 plus years ago, did you ever think that this would be what your biggest accomplishment was, that being a part of professional wrestling would be your journalism journey?
No. I started off, I was doing sports on the 6 and 10 o'clock news at the NBC affiliate in Rochester, Minnesota. And, I, growing up in the Twin Cities, I mean, I watched like everyone else, the AWA. Never imagined or could have imagined that, I would end up doing professional wrestling for all those years and the places it would take me and people I would get to meet. Nor if you had asked me a couple of years ago if I ever thought I'd be doing wrestling again, I would have said, there's 2 chances, slim and none, and Slim's already packing to catch the next freight out of town. But, it's great, and I really enjoy Ring Warriors,
Right.
getting a chance to work with Howard again, and a lot of the, younger wrestlers I knew of but hadn't really worked with or hadn't gotten a chance to know. In fact, one of the neatest things, obviously, I was well aware of him, but till I went out to the first Ring Warriors taping, I had never had a chance to meet or certainly not work with Austin Aries. And, I think, he knew who I was, so it was great. We got a chance both days to just sit down kind of one-on-one and talk about the business a little bit.
Very cool. Very cool.
And, we got to, some of the younger, crazier guys. And it was great, although, again, boy, you talk about starting to feel old. I worked with Wes Briscoe's dad, Jerry, was in WWF, and now Wes is at Ring Warriors and such a great talent. But sometimes you sit back and I'm watching him, in the ring and think, my God, I worked with his dad. I'm getting old. And they're like, there's some great young talent. Besides Wes, a really fun tag team, the Slambinos, and then you've got some kind of guys that you probably remember, and I certainly do. Remind me of like Sid Vicious, Psycho Sid, or Nails. I mean, you've got like Martin Casaus.
Oh yeah.
Alexander Hammerstone, and now they're bringing in Lance Hoyt. And I'm thinking to myself, well, this is going to get a little out of control more than likely at some point.
Yep, Lance Hoyt's a great guy. It's pretty cool you mentioned the Wes Briscoe. That aired just this past week, and you guys, there was obviously a kinship. He obviously has a high respect for you, and it obviously was cool for you to be part of interviewing him and having him as part of Ring Warriors as well. I did have that noted down on my notepad in underlined letters, Wes Briscoe. So pretty cool you mentioned that.
It was, from a personal standpoint, and again on social media, I know what a great family the Briscoes are, and talk about second generation, actually third generation, but how proud Jerry is of Wes, and how proud Wes is and embraces his legacy, and plus all those things are great, but if you're not a great in-ring talent, it doesn't mean much. But Wes is a great in-ring talent. Had some rough patches, as he alluded to,
right,
but has developed into such a good guy.
I believe it. All right, final question for you, and then a favor I have to ask. Final question is, you mentioned all the incoming, as our president sometimes calls it when he gets negative press, the negative things people say about WWE. Well, there's some of that about Ring Warriors as well. Maybe some of it they make fair points. Some of it just seems to be sour grapes. What does Ring Warriors have to do to silence critics and to continue to do what they're doing and grow at what they're doing?
Well, I think a lot of it, they are doing. I always try and be honest whenever I talk to anybody, and be honest. There was some growing pains on that first show and the second show. You had a lot of people that had never ever worked together. But I think the show this past Saturday was awfully good. There were some good matches. Some of the kinks got worked out, and I think what they're doing is continuing to try and get better. But some of that first show wasn't the best, but compared, the show this past Saturday was a good, wrestling show. Austin Aries on commentary, I think, added a lot to it. If we could just kind of work to get him to be a little more confident when he talks about himself. But the match with Wes Briscoe and Monster Tarver, was a good match, and the match with which was a tournament match, and I surmise that Austin Aries in size and style is somewhat like Wes Briscoe, and they kind of threw Tarver out at the last minute. Wes survived that one. The last match with Jeff Cobb and Luke Hawx, Aries, made his presence felt at ringside, and Luke Hawx, maybe let him get under his skin a little too much and got counted out. Jeff advanced, but had the chance to talk to Jeff afterwards. And as strange as it sounded, like almost made him more motivated that, even though he advanced, you could say that win was a little bit tainted because Luke Hawx got counted out. But, those are old style good matches. And I think that's what Ring Warriors is striving to do and certainly making strides towards.
I agree. And, I wrote my review of the first show, and there were problems. There was a couple entrance issues. There was a botched finish and things like that. But overall, it was nice to see a different perspective of wrestling presented, and I think that was much, much better. And we talked about this, offline, off the air, that it was the best presentation of what Ring Warriors is trying to do this past Saturday. So hopefully, going forward, and hopefully with the next tapings coming up in October. We're in October.
Yeah.
Just a few weeks. Hopefully that will be
next the 10th and 11th, next Wednesday and Thursday. So I've got to get the obligatory plug in. If you happen to find yourself in the Las Vegas area, Ring Warriors will be at Sam's Town Live next Wednesday, the 10th, and Thursday, the 11th.
Very cool. Looking forward to seeing how those turn out, and I'll be tuning in on WGN America on every Saturday morning. So I mentioned a favor.
Sure.
Do you mind if I probably already know what it is. It's just a station ID just saying this is Ken Resnick, and you're in the Wrestling Epicenter.
Oh, sure.
Do you mind giving me one?
This is Ken Resnick, and I'm where else? In the Wrestling Epicenter.
This is the Wrestling Epicenter. For over 15 years, we've brought you the top names in professional wrestling for exclusive interviews. Everybody you see here has been interviewed by our site. But we're more than just interviews. So be sure and check out WrestlingEpicenter.com for news, results, information, and of course our store. WrestlingEpicenter.com, your #1 source for wrestling information.